Hello, this is Brian, and for the next hour, I'll be reading from the May 19th issue of the Toronto Star on the Niagara Frontier radio reading service. Community grieves beloved San Diego Mosque security guard killed on the job. One of the 3 people killed by 2 teen shooters at a San Diego mosque was a beloved security guard who acted quickly to prevent more deaths, authorities and community members said. Amin Abdullah was a security guard who greeted everyone that arrived at the Islamic Center of San Diego with a smile and the traditional Muslim greeting in Arabic of As-salamu alaikum, or peace be upon you, according to Mahmoud Ahmadi, a longtime attendee of the mosque. Authorities have not released the names of the 3 victims, but family friend Sheikh Utman ibn Farouk identified Abdullah, saying he had spoken with one of Abdullah's sons as the family began to make funeral plans. He wanted to defend the innocent, so he decided to become a security guard, Farouk said. Abdullah had worked at the mosque for more than a decade. He was there nearly every single day and was dedicated to his wife and 9 kids, Farouk said. San Diego Police Chief Scott Wall said a mosque security guard, without naming Abdullah, played a pivotal role in preventing the attack from being more deadly. It's fair to say his actions were heroic, the chief said Monday. Undoubtedly, he saved lives today. The Islamic Center of San Diego is one of the largest mosques in San Diego and attracts thousands of people from across the region during major holidays. In addition to having prayer 5 times a day, it also provides dinners and breakfasts during the Ramadan fasting period, hosts a school for Arabic and Islamic studies, and has a store inside. Abdullah was raised Christian and described in the 2019 YouTube video his journey discovering the Islamic faith after graduating high school. My mother saw a change in me, he said. I'm starting to help out around the house, being more respectful. I got a job. Farouk said he met Abdullah shortly after he became a Muslim in the 1990s. Most recently, they had gone on a pilgrimage trip to Mecca together. Abdullah always had a positive attitude, even when he fell sick during the trip, Farouk said. Even when he was feeling ill, he was just a very light-hearted, genuine person, always smiling, always taking care of others, Farouk said. Josie Anna Edenshaw still recalls meeting Abdullah her first time visiting the mosque. She was stressed and couldn't figure out where to park when he waved her down to help. Edenshaw said the community was heartbroken by Abdullah's death. In a WhatsApp group of congregants, a teacher who was at the school during the shooting described how Abdullah called in active shooter on his walkie-talkie when he saw the shooters, warning the staff members and teachers inside. The teacher was not available for an interview. Every single day, those kids had that amazing security guard that protected them, Edenshaw said. That's something that's going to impact them every single day for the rest of their life. Abbas Rakhmatov, who has attended the mosque for 3 years, was shaken after being there in the morning, just before the shooting happened. He said Abdullah took his duties seriously, always walking around and checking the grounds. He was the model for every one of us, said Rakhmatov, always smiling, always caring about our community. WHO worries about Ebola outbreak scale and spread as Congo announces 134 deaths. The World Health Organization Director General openly worried Tuesday over the scale and speed of an outbreak of a rare type of Ebola in eastern Congo, where authorities reported a sharp increase in suspected deaths to at least 134 and more than 500 suspected cases. The virus spread undetected for weeks after the first known death as authorities tested for a more common type of Ebola and came up negative, health experts and aid workers said. The Bundibugyo virus has no approved medicines or vaccines. Congo was expecting shipments from the United States and Britain of CHAD-0X1, an experimental vaccine developed by researchers at Oxford and designed to target the more common types of Ebola, Zaire and Sudan, Jean-Jacques Muyembe, a virologist at the National Institute of Biomedical Research, told journalists. We will administer the vaccine and see who develops the disease, he said. WHO Director General Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus said he was deeply concerned about the scale and speed of the epidemic, and the UN Health Agency convened its emergency committee on Tuesday. He pointed to the emergence of cases in urban areas, the deaths of healthcare workers, and significant population movement. The head of the UNICEF office in Bunia, the site of the first known death, said it had been sent an initial 16 tons of relief supplies, mainly disinfectants and soaps, personal protective equipment, and water purification tablets and water tanks. WHO expects the outbreak to last for weeks at least. WHO has declared the Ebola outbreak a public health emergency of international concern, requiring a coordinated response. Resources were being rushed to 2 affected provinces near Uganda, which has reported 1 death, person who traveled from Congo. Parts of the region are in the hands of armed rebels. The head of the WHO team in Congo said authorities haven't identified patient 0. Dr. Anne Ansia also said the Ervebo vaccine used against a different type of Ebola was among those considered for possible use, but anything approved would take 2 months to become available. I don't see that in 2 months we will be done with this outbreak, she said. For now, Ansia said neither the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention nor the Africa Centers for Disease Control were on the ground, but others were, including Doctors Without Borders and the Red Cross. Cases have been confirmed in the capital of Congo's Ituri province, Bunia, North Kivu's rebel-held capital, Goma, and the localities of Mangwalu, Nyakunde, and Butembo, home to over 1 million people in all. Dr. Peter Stafford, an American doctor, is among the Bunia cases, said Surge, the Christian organization he works for. He had been treating patients at a hospital. 3 other Surge employees, including Stafford's wife, weren't showing symptoms. False negative tests delayed response. Congo has said the first person died from the virus on April 24th in Bunia, and the body was repatriated to the Mangwala Health Zone, a mining area with a large population. That caused the Ebola outbreak to escalate, said Congo's health minister, Samuel Roger Kamba. When another person fell ill on April 26th, samples were sent to Congo's capital, Kinshasa, for testing. According to the Africa CDC, Bunia is more than 1,000 kilometers or 620 miles away in a country with some of the world's worst infrastructure. Samples from Bunia were initially tested for the more common type of Ebola, Zaire, Congolese officials said. They came back negative, said Dr. Richard Katenge, the Health Ministry Incident Manager for Ebola. On May 5th, WHO was alerted of about 50 deaths in Mangwulu, including 4 health workers. The first confirmation of Ebola came on May 14th. Our surveillance system didn't work, Mayumbe said. The Bunia laboratory should have continued searching and sent the samples to the national laboratory. Something went wrong here. That's why we ended up in this catastrophic situation. Only laboratories in Kinshasa and Goma, which is now controlled by the Rwanda-backed M23 rebel group, have the capacity to test for the Bundibugyo type of Ebola. Benjamin Bonimpa, M23's permanent secretary, has said the rebel government had established entry and exit points in Goma and would take responsibility for funeral services if the virus continues to spread. Our priority is to protect the population within our jurisdiction, and we urge people to resume their daily activities, he said. Matthew M. Cavanaugh, director of the Georgetown University Center for Global Health Policy and Politics, has criticized the Trump administration's earlier decision to withdraw from WHO and make deep cuts in foreign aid. The exact surveillance system meant to catch these viruses early, he said. The U.S. State Department has said it sprang into action immediately and has provided $13 million for the response. There is growing panic among some residents. Ebola is highly contagious and can be contracted via bodily fluids such as vomit, blood, or semen. The disease it causes is rare, but severe and often fatal. Symptoms include fever, headache, muscle pain, weakness, diarrhea, vomiting, stomach pain, and unexpected bleeding or bruising. During an outbreak more than a decade ago that killed more than 11,000 people, many were infected while washing bodies during funerals. Ebola is very much a disease of compassion in that it impacts the people who are more likely to be taking care of sick folks, said Dr. Craig Spencer, an associate professor at the Brown University School of Public Health, who survived Ebola more than a decade ago after contracting it in Guinea. There was growing panic in Bunia neighborhoods. I know the consequences of Ebola. I know what it's like, resident Noella Lumo said. She previously lived in Beni, hit by former outbreaks. When she heard about the latest one, she began making protective masks by hand. Local authorities in Bunia urged people to remain calm and adhere to preventative measures, including practicing good hygiene and exercising caution during funeral ceremonies. The most important challenge is breaking the virus transmission chain, Muyembe said. Of all of the 17 epidemics we have experienced in Congo, 15 were brought under control simply by applying public health measures, he said. Nigeria says its joint strikes with the U.S. have killed 175 Islamic State fighters. A joint operation against Islamic State fighters by Nigeria and the United States has killed 175 of the fighters over the past few days, the Nigerian military said Tuesday. Military spokesperson Samila Uba said in a statement that the strike also destroyed weapons, checkpoints, and financial networks of the militants across the northeastern region of the country. The gains against the militants followed the killing late last week of the group's local chapter deputy Abu Bakr el-Manuki in the first successful targeting of a senior militant in more than a decade of insurgency in the country. The Nigerian military on Tuesday reported the killing of another senior leader, Abd al-Wahhab, responsible for coordinating finance and attack planning and logistics. The U.S. Africa Command confirmed the attacks, saying no U.S. or Nigerian troops were harmed. In February, the U.S. sent troops to Nigeria in what was deemed a mostly advisory and training role, but the joint operation in recent days signals more active U.S. involvement. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the Toronto Star on the Niagara Frontier radio reading service. Trump's tough talk foreign policy is hitting a wall with Iran as it grips Strait of Hormuz. President Donald Trump has considered himself an effective dealmaker above all else, but he appears to have hit a wall with Iran as his tough talk threats and even military action have not moved Tehran from its long-established positions. With shifting goals that make it difficult to judge the status of the U.S. effort, Trump and his top aides have insisted the United States has already won the war and that Iran is ready to reach an agreement in the wake of escalating U.S. threats during a tenuous ceasefire. But Trump once again backed down, saying Monday that he had put plans for an imminent resumption of attacks on hold at the request of Gulf Arab states, because serious negotiations are now taking place, and that, in their opinion, as great leaders and allies, a deal will be made which will be very acceptable to the United States of America, as well as all countries in the Middle East and beyond. Although he said he had called off strikes planned for Tuesday, Trump kept up the bravado, saying he told military leaders to be prepared to go forward with a full, large-scale assault of Iran on a moment's notice in the event that an acceptable deal is not reached. Trump has repeatedly set deadlines for Tehran and then backed off. Despite growing internal unrest, a crippled economy, and the deaths of many of its leaders, there is no evidence that Iran is set to meet Trump's demands, many of which it has long rejected. In fact, it has dug in. That has left Trump's stated top objectives unrealized. Iran has yet to agree to abandon its nuclear program or its ballistic missile development or cease support for its proxies in the region, including those in Gaza, Iraq, Lebanon, and Yemen. The White House on Monday defended the president's approach, saying, "Trump's preference is always peace and diplomacy, but he will only accept a deal that puts America first." President Trump holds all the cards and wisely keeps all options on the table to ensure that Iran can never have a nuclear weapon, spokesperson Olivia Wales said in a statement to the Associated Press. Iran has leverage with the Strait of Hormuz. Crucially, Iran still has a chokehold on the Strait of Hormuz, the vital shipping lane for global oil supplies, even as the U.S. military has enforced its own blockade on Iranian ports. The wild shifts in the global energy market that followed have raised gasoline prices, hurting U.S. consumers and causing potential problems for Trump's Republican Party ahead of congressional midterm elections in November. Trump's playbook of turning up the pressure, economically and militarily, to bend foreign governments to his will is not playing out in Iran as it has in Venezuela, Cuba, and elsewhere. Oil blockades have squeezed those two countries, and the Trump administration quickly ousted Venezuelan leader Nicolas Maduro, but they do not hold a bargaining chip as effective as Iran's control over the Strait of Hormuz. With the Iran war driving up costs for Americans, Trump's approval rating on the economy has slumped, according to an AP NORC poll conducted last month, with even Republicans showing less faith in his leadership. For all of Trump's rhetoric, Iran has been unwilling to accept limitations on any of its policies that amount to more than what it conceded during the negotiations for a nuclear deal with world powers during the Obama administration. Trump called it the worst ever agreement negotiated by the U.S. and pulled out of it in his first term in 2018. Since a fragile truce in the war went into effect last month, Trump has lashed out over the slow pace of negotiations to reach a permanent deal. For Iran, the clock is ticking, and they better get moving fast, or there won't be anything left of them, Trump posted on social media Sunday, shortly after a call with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. The Iranian response was quick. Our armed forces' fingers are on the trigger while diplomacy is also continuing, Mohsen Rizai, a military advisor to Iran's supreme leader, said on state television. Neither side sees defeat, expert says. Ali Vez, Iran director at the International Crisis Group, who has watched years of fruitless diplomacy between Washington and Tehran, said the longtime adversaries do not see themselves as being defeated by the latest conflict. Since the ceasefire took effect, both Washington and Tehran seem to be working on the assumption that time acts in their favor. Each believes that the blockade and counter-blockade in the Strait of Hormuz raises the costs for the other side while giving a reprieve to prepare for a potential resumption of hostilities, Vaez said. Despite the impact of America's economic pressure campaign, Iranian officials have not reached the pain threshold to the point of accepting what it perceives as capitulatory demands, he said. David Schenker, a former Assistant Secretary of State for the Middle East in Trump's first administration, who is currently at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, described the current situation as a stalemate. He said Trump likely has misgivings about returning to full-on military conflict, especially because of Gulf Arab anxieties about Iranian retaliation and the volatility in the energy markets, with its political implications in the U.S. Rich Goldberg, an Iran hawk and former National Security Council official in both of Trump's administrations, who is now with the Foundation for Defense of Democracy's think tank, insisted that Trump is still operating from a position of strength, including with the Strait of Hormuz. Goldberg, who has a special interest in American energy dominance, said that while reopening the strait would ease the pain at the pump felt by many Americans, it was not critical. The short-term pain at the pump is distracting people from U.S. overall energy dominance, he said. This is not a permanent crisis. Bessent grants a 30-day extension for Russian oil and tankers as Iran war squeezes supply. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent said Monday that the U.S. will give a 30-day extension for countries to import Russian oil that is already in tankers at sea, a move that is meant to reduce the oil supply shortages caused by the Iran war. The announcement marks a continued policy reversal by an administration that had previously said the sanctions on Russian oil would resume. Originally announced in early March, the temporary waiver on the sanctions was first renewed in April, just 2 days after Bessent said at the White House that he had no plans to extend the sanctions relief. The latest extension for another 30 days comes after Bessent told the Associated Press that the waiver on Russian oil sanctions would lapse, a sign of the lasting global economic challenges created by the Iran war, as shortages are pushing up prices that are hampering growth. Bessent said the extension would help poor nations in need of oil because China would no longer have the same ability to stockpile discounted oil from Russia. But there are risks, as the temporary lifting of sanctions would help Russia finance its war in Ukraine. This extension will provide additional flexibility, and we will work with these nations to provide specific licenses as needed, Bessent said on social media. Iraqi man accused of plotting U.S. consulate shooting in Toronto, another attack at a synagogue. In Canada, we have our guys. An Iraqi man being accused of helping orchestrate terror attacks around the globe, including a March shooting at the U.S. consulate in Toronto and another targeting a Canadian synagogue, allegedly spoke about having allies in Canada while soliciting help to hit more targets here, a U.S. Department of Justice document reveals. Mohammed Bakr Saad Dawood al-Sadi, 32, was charged with 6 terrorism-related offenses by the U.S. government Friday for his alleged role in plotting nearly 20 attacks and attempted attacks across Europe, the U.S., and Canada in recent months. El-Sadi was a commander with Kataib Hezbollah, a Shia militant group in Syria and Iran, and an operative for Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard, according to investigators. In an unsealed criminal complaint submitted by FBI Special Agent Catherine McDonald, El-Sadi was recorded discussing the attacks and the range of his terror connections to a confidential informant in multiple phone conversations. The document also contains social media postings descriptions of the attacks, and online communications. In Europe, we have our guys. Even in America, for example, the other day, and in Canada, we have our guys, al-Sadi was quoted as saying. U.S. prosecutors allege al-Sadi and other unnamed associates planned and claimed responsibility for a number of attacks, including the bombing of a Bank of New York Mellon building in Amsterdam in mid-March, and a thwarted bomb attack on a Bank of America office in Paris on March 28th, in response to the U.S. and Israel's decision to wage war on Iran in February. The document continued by noting that al-Sadi had asked the informant, identified only as SOI-1, short for Source of Information, for assistance in carrying out attacks in U.S. and Canada. al-Sadi stated that he would give SOI-1 the targets, such as Jewish synagogues, Zionist headquarters, and that al-Sadi does not have a problem with killing, neither do I have a problem with terrifying the targets. Al-Sadi, who appeared in a Manhattan court on Friday, also allegedly sought to attack a New York synagogue last month and provided the informant with photos and maps of Jewish centers in Los Angeles and Scottsdale, Arizona, that he planned to target. In summarizing another wiretapped call, McDonald wrote that al-Sadi was taking credit for organizing 2 attacks in Canada. He confirmed that our people were also behind 2 attacks in Canada against the consulate and the Knesset, the first of which I believe refers to a March 10, 2026 shooting at the U.S. consulate in Toronto, Canada, and the second of which I believe refers to an attack on a synagogue. The document didn't specify where the other attack had occurred in Canada or provide further details on what it meant by Knesset. The Star requested clarification from the Department of Justice and asked if any Canadian police forces were involved in the investigation, but didn't receive a response by publication time. RCMP didn't respond to questions on Sunday. We have no information to share at this time, said Shannon Eames, spokesperson for the Toronto Police Service, when asked about al-Sadi's arrest and his alleged role in the U.S. consulate shooting in the city. On March 10th, around 4:30 a.m., a white Honda CR-V was heading southbound on University Avenue when it reportedly stopped in front of the U.S. consulate on University Avenue in Toronto. 2 men got out of the vehicle and fired multiple rounds at the building with a handgun before fleeing. Police arrived an hour later and found gun shell casings and damage to the door. RCMP Chief Superintendent Chris Leather at the time called it a national security incident. While police have released images of the suspect vehicle, no suspects have been identified and no arrests have been announced by Toronto police. People were reportedly in the building at the time of the shooting, but no one was hurt. There have been several shootings targeting synagogues in Toronto so far this year, but it's unknown whether any of those incidents have ties to al-Sadi and his network. Earlier this month, police arrested an 18-year-old man in connection to 2 shootings at Toronto area synagogues in early March. The accused can't be named because he was 17 at the time of the shootings. No one was hurt in either incident. Canada must work with its U.S. counterparts to establish the veracity of these claims and protect itself from any potential threats to its national security, wrote Simon Wohl Benay Brith, Canada's Chief Executive Officer, in an email statement to the Star, adding that the Jewish advocacy group has repeatedly urged Ottawa to investigate attacks on Jewish institutions as potential acts of terror. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the Toronto Star on the Niagara Frontier radio reading service. After UPS plane crash, 10 similar flaws were recorded. NTSB says no one raised an alarm. After the engine flew off a UPS cargo plane and caused a crash that killed 15 people in Kentucky, investigators found records of 10 previous flaws in the same key parts that help secure engines to wings of other similar planes, most of them never reported to the Federal Aviation Administration. The National Transportation Safety Board focused Tuesday on why no one in government or the industry spotted the concerning trend and took action to prevent it before last November's crash. Investigators also released more than 2,000 pages of related documents as the board began 2 days of hearings in Washington to examine the disaster's root causes. The engine separated from the MD-11's left wing as it accelerated down the runway, Louisville's Muhammad Ali International Airport. The crash killed all 3 pilots on the plane and 12 people on the ground. 23 more were injured. FAA and UPS officials said the reports they did get about problems related to the spherical bearings that have been a focus of the crash investigation may not have included enough information. UPS's David Springer said Boeing's service letters made the bearing problem sound almost benign and didn't mention any of the collateral damage that could be caused to the lugs that attached the engine to the wing. I think if we would have known that at UPS, I think we would have asked a lot of different questions over the years, Springer said. The hearings at the NTSB headquarters involved rounds of questions and answers among board members, investigators, and representatives of Boeing, UPS, the mechanics union, and other parties. The NTSB's final report likely won't be ready until more than a year after the crash because it will look at every potential factor. Here's what you should know: the crash. The documents released Tuesday revealed that UPS switched planes hours before the crash after a pre-flight inspection found a fuel leak in the first plane loaded for the trip to Hawaii. The cargo was then loaded onto a second plane, and the flight crew shared good-natured banter with the maintenance team during its inspection about meeting again so soon. The second plane promptly lost its left engine and barely cleared the airport fence before crashing into nearby businesses in a massive fireball. Dramatic images the NTSB released after the crash showed the engine detaching as flames erupted on the wing. The plane was already ablaze as it briefly got airborne, leaving behind trails of smoke. Examining the wreckage, investigators found cracks in some of the parts that held the engines to the wing, the NTSB said. Those cracks hadn't been caught in regular maintenance, which raised questions about the adequacy of the maintenance schedule. The last time those key engine mount parts were examined closely was in October 2021, and the plane wasn't due for another detailed inspection for roughly 7,000 more takeoffs and landings. Meanwhile, all MD-11s and DC-10s, predecessor aircraft, were grounded after the Louisville crash. NTSB investigators said Tuesday that similar part flaws were subsequently found in 3 other UPS planes and a DC-10. Past problems. NTSB member Tom Chapman said investigators also found 10 different earlier examples of flaws in MD-11s dating back more than 15 years, involving the same key part that failed in Louisville, but only 4 were reported to the FAA. Chapman said all of them should have been reported. FAA officials testified Tuesday that 4 spread over years would not have been enough to demonstrate a problem trend. Boeing determined that those flaws would not result in a safety of flight condition, so the plane maker didn't require plane owners to make repairs, and the FAA never issued an airworthiness directive that would have ensured that was done. Instead, Boeing just recommended replacing the bearings with a redesigned part that was less likely to fail. UPS officials told the NTSB that they could have done more to prevent the crash if they had only known more. The Louisville disaster was reminiscent of a 1979 crash in Chicago involving a DC-10. The left engine also fell off in that crash, which killed 273 people and led to the worldwide grounding of 274 DC-10s. The airliner returned to the skies because the NTSB determined that maintenance workers had damaged the plane that crashed while improperly using a forklift to reattach the engine. That meant the crash wasn't caused by a fatal design flaw, even though there had already been a number of accidents involving DC-10s. But even at that point, the plane's manufacturer, McDonnell Douglas, raised concerns about the spherical bearing that helps hold the engines to the wings. McDonnell Douglas later merged with Boeing. MD-11s planes flying again. Some MD-11s, a workhorse of the cargo fleet, are now back in the air after the FAA approved Boeing's plan to replace the spherical bearing on each aircraft and increase inspections. FedEx resumed using the planes to deliver packages on May 10th, but UPS has said it plans to retire its fleet of MD-11s. Western Global also uses MD-11s, but hasn't said what it plans to do. Some experts speculated after the crash that the MD-11s might never fly again if the repair proved to be more expensive than what it was worth in these older planes. But Boeing said it found a way to address the safety concerns simply by replacing the bearing and stepping up inspections. Rubio heads to a NATO FM's meeting as European angst over Trump reliability, U.S. troops, Iran grows. Secretary of State Marco Rubio will travel this week to a NATO foreign ministers meeting in Sweden, where U.S. plans to reduce troop levels in Europe, coupled with President Donald Trump's often inconsistent stance on the alliance, have created concern while the world grapples with the fallout from the Iran war and rising energy prices. The State Department said Tuesday that Rubio would attend the NATO meeting in Helsingborg on Friday, one of the last senior-level NATO gatherings before alliance leaders meet at a summit in Ankara, Turkey in July. Rubio will then travel on to India and plans to visit 4 cities, including Kolkata, Agra, Jaipur, and New Delhi, where he will see Indian officials and is expected to meet with his Indian, Australian, and Japanese counterparts, the other 3 members of the so-called Quad grouping of Indo-Pacific democracies. In Sweden, Rubio will echo previous U.S. demands for increased defense investment and greater burden sharing in the alliance, the State Department said in a statement. It added that he would also focus on Arctic issues and meet with NATO's Arctic members to discuss our shared economic and security interests in the Arctic and our strengthened posture in the High North. The statement did not mention Greenland by name, but Trump has rankled Europeans with persistent talk about wanting to take over the Danish territory. Trump's special envoy for Greenland, Louisiana Governor Jeff Landry, visited the island this week. Greenland's Prime Minister Jens Frederik Nielsen said Monday that he had a respectful and positive meeting with Landry, but that he made it clear that the Greenlandic people insist on self-determination. The Greenlandic people are not for sale. Greenlandic self-determination is not something that can be negotiated, Nielsen was quoted by Danish TV2 as saying after meeting with Landry. For Europeans nervous about Trump, Rubio's presence at transatlantic meetings has often been welcomed because of his less antagonistic nature and calm demeanor. He has been dispatched on several such missions this year, including to the Munich Security Conference in February and more recently to Italy, where he met with Italian officials and the Pope after Trump criticized the pontiff for his stances on crime and the Iran war. Ahead of the NATO foreign ministers' meeting, the alliance's top military officer said Tuesday that he doesn't expect any more drawdowns of American troops from Europe, at least not anytime soon, beyond the 5,000 that Trump announced would leave the continent. The remarks by U.S. Lieutenant General Alex Grynkevich follow Trump's surprise announcement of the move early this month. The U.S. leader has bickered with allies over the Iran war and called for changes. The Pentagon later said it would draw down thousands of troops in Europe by canceling deployments to Poland and Germany, as opposed to yanking out forces already stationed there. Asked Tuesday about Trump's plans regarding troop levels in Poland, Vice President J.D. Vance said the administration's focus is on promoting European independence and sovereignty. He also disputed that the U.S. is reducing troop levels in Poland. What we did is that we delayed a troop deployment that was going to go to Poland, Vance told White House reporters. That's not a reduction, that's just a standard delay in rotation that sometimes happens in these situations. Trump's announcement blindsided NATO and came despite U.S. promises to coordinate military moves with its allies and avoid creating security gaps. Trump was notably angry at Germany after Chancellor Friedrich Merz said the United States was being humiliated by the Iranian leadership and criticized what he called a lack of U.S. strategy in the war. Russia holds massive drills of its nuclear forces as Ukraine steps up its drone attacks. Russia on Tuesday began massive maneuvers of its nuclear forces, featuring practice launches of nuclear-capable ballistic and cruise missiles and drills that come amid surge in Ukrainian drone strikes. The 3-day exercise will involve 64,000 troops, over 200 missile launchers, more than 140 aircraft, 73 surface warships, and 13 submarines, including 8 armed with nuclear-tipped intercontinental ballistic missiles, the Defense Ministry said. The maneuvers will focus on the preparation and use of nuclear forces under the threat of aggression, the ministry said. The drills will also practice cooperation with Belarus, a neighbor and ally that hosts Russian nuclear weapons. Russian arsenals in Belarus include its latest intermediate-range nuclear-capable Oreshnik missile system. The maneuvers come as Ukraine has sharply intensified its drone attacks against Russia, including a weekend barrage on Moscow's suburbs that killed 3 and damaged several buildings and industrial facilities. Russian President Vladimir Putin has repeatedly reminded the world about Moscow's nuclear arsenals after sending troops into Ukraine in February 2022 to try to deter the West from ramping up support for Kiev. The recent attacks have made it harder for officials in the Kremlin to cast the conflict in Ukraine, now in its 5th year, as something so distant that it doesn't affect daily routines of Russian civilians. The exercise unfolded as Putin on Tuesday is starting a 2-day visit to China. Last week, he praised a successful test launch of the new Sarmat ICBM, which is set to replace aging Soviet-built nuclear missiles. In 2024, Putin adopted a revised nuclear doctrine, noting that any nation's conventional attack on Russia that is supported by a nuclear power will be considered a joint attack on his country. That threat was clearly aimed at discouraging the West from allowing Ukraine to strike Russia with longer-range weapons and appears to significantly lower the threshold for the possible use of Russia's nuclear arsenal. Russian hawks long have urged the Kremlin to respond to the growing Ukrainian attacks by striking Kiev's allies in Europe with conventional weapons, arguing that European NATO members wouldn't dare to retaliate and enter a direct military conflict with the world's largest nuclear power. Last month, the Defense Ministry published a list of factories in Europe that it said were involved in producing drones and their components for Ukraine. It warned that attacks on Russia involving drones manufactured in Europe are fraught with unpredictable consequences. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the Toronto Star on the Niagara Frontier radio reading service. Board of Peace will ask the UN Security Council to press Hamas to disarm. The body overseeing the U.S.-brokered ceasefire in Gaza will ask the United Nations Security Council to press the Hamas militant group to disarm, according to a report seen by the Associated Press on Tuesday. The report by the Board of Peace, an international body set up by U.S. President Donald Trump and tasked with overseeing the fragile ceasefire between Hamas and Israel, is expected to be discussed by the Security Council on Thursday when it meets on the situation in the Middle East. At this stage, the principal obstacle to full implementation of the ceasefire remains Hamas's refusal to accept verified decommissioning, relinquish coercive control, and permit a genuine civilian transition in Gaza, the report said. Hamas, in a statement, rejected the report and said it contains fallacies. A diplomat familiar with the report confirmed its authenticity, speaking on condition of anonymity because it has not been made public. Trump's 20-point ceasefire plan calls on Hamas to surrender its weapons and destroy its vast network of tunnels. It also envisions Israeli forces withdrawing from Gaza, the arrival of a new technocratic Palestinian government, deployment of an international security force, and the rebuilding of the battered Palestinian enclave after more than 2 years of war. Board of Peace head has said the ceasefire has stalled. Last week, the head of the Board of Peace, former UN Mideast envoy Nikolay Mladenov, acknowledged that the truce had stalled since taking effect in October, saying the deadlock over disarming Hamas had paralyzed progress. Reconstruction cannot commence where weapons have not been laid down, the board's report to the Security Council says. The critical variable, the single factor that unlocks every other element of the plan, is the conclusion of an agreement on the roadmap for the full implementation of the plan that includes full decommissioning by Hamas and all armed groups in Gaza. The Palestinian militant group, which led the October 7, 2023 attack on Israel that sparked the war in Gaza, has accused Israel of failing to meet its obligations under the first phase of the ceasefire and has sought to link any demilitarization to Israeli troop pullbacks. Israel's military has expanded its control of Gaza since the truce took effect and now controls some 60% of the territory. The new report calls on the Security Council to reiterate publicly, clearly, and consistently that the decommissioning of weapons in Gaza is not merely a requirement of the UN's resolution to end the war, but critical for reconstruction to begin, for a time-bound Israeli forces withdrawal, and for a credible pathway to Palestinian self-determination and statehood to be pursued. The Security Council endorsed the Board of Peace in a resolution in November. Hamas says the report tries to derail the ceasefire. Hamas said the report contains a number of fallacies that absolve the occupying government of its responsibilities for the daily violations of the ceasefire agreement in Gaza. The group said the report ignored Israel's failure to uphold the majority of its commitments in the ceasefire deal, including the continued restrictions on crossings into the Palestinian territory and preventing the entry of material and equipment needed to repair basic infrastructure and shelter for the largely displaced population. The report's adoption of the occupation's conditions regarding disarmament is a dubious attempt to muddy the waters and derail the ceasefire agreement, Hamas said in a statement. It called on the Security Council and Mladenov to compel Israel to fulfill its commitments under the ceasefire deal's first phase. Foremost among them, the cessation of the daily aggression against our Palestinian people in Gaza. The ceasefire has seen numerous violations. The report noted near-daily ceasefire violations, some of which are serious and their human consequences, civilians killed, families living in fear, and continued impediments to humanitarian access cannot be minimized. Israel's military still carries out airstrikes in Gaza despite the ceasefire and has pushed deeper into the territory where it now controls more than it was granted under the ceasefire agreement. Living conditions are dire, with most of the territory's 2 million people living in tent camps, lacking basic services. Ladenov last week said his office is addressing violations by both sides on a daily basis, but he reportedly cited the disarmament issue as a central sticking point, saying Hamas's obligation to give up its arsenal is not negotiable and that progress on all other issues was being held up. NAACP calls for boycott of Southern college sports programs over voting rights. The NAACP is calling on black athletes and fans to boycott the athletic programs of public universities in states that are taking steps that the nation's oldest civil rights group says are restricting black voting rights. Launched on Tuesday, the Out of Bounds campaign urges prospective black athletes, their families, alumni, and fans to withhold athletic and financial support from major public universities in states that have moved to limit, weaken, or erase black voting representation. If black athletes participate in the boycott, it could deplete rosters for powerhouse football and basketball programs across the Southeastern Conference and Athletic Coast Conference. The NAACP is among groups responding to a wave of gerrymandering in the aftermath of a U.S. Supreme Court ruling that winnowed a key provision of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. The boycott comes as civil rights activists have mobilized across the South to protest redistricting plans by Republican state legislatures that eliminate majority black congressional districts after the High Court's ruling. Activists have looked for pressure points to dissuade GOP-led states from redistricting maps, including calls for mass protests and economic boycotts. Across the South, black athletes have helped build some of the most profitable college athletic programs in America, said NAACP President Derek Johnson. Johnson noted that the programs generate hundreds of millions of dollars in annual revenue, national television value, alumni donations, merchandising sales, ticket sales, and brand equity, much of it powered by black football and basketball talent. The NAACP's campaign calls out Alabama, Florida, Georgia, Louisiana, Mississippi, Texas, and South Carolina as states to boycott, arguing that the athletic programs of those states' flagship universities are especially reliant on black athletic talent and should protect black political interests. Black athletes should not be asked to generate wealth, prestige, and power for state institutions, while those same states strip political power from black communities, Johnson said. The timing of the initiative comes at a moment in the college athletic calendar that might make it difficult for it to have any immediate impact. The transfer portals for the high-profile Division I sports of football and basketball are all closed until 2027. There may be an opportunity to influence prominent high school recruits who are still weighing their college prospects for the fall of 2027 and beyond. While many schools have received non-binding verbal agreements from football and basketball players, those agreements won't become official until late fall at the earliest. The signing window for basketball opens in mid-November, about a week after the midterm elections, and the 72-hour early signing period for football arrives in the first week of December. There is a chance that recruits could attempt to put pressure on flagship institutions in the targeted states by threatening to sign somewhere else, The reality, however, is that the pockets of those schools run deep, and asking a teenager to factor politics into a decision that could produce a life-altering financial windfall before they are even old enough to vote could prove tenuous. Black lawmakers themselves are also putting pressure on athletic leagues to take action against Republican-led states that may redistrict longtime black members of Congress. The Congressional Black Caucus on Monday sent a letter to the commissioners of SEC and ACC athletic conferences, as well as NCAA President Charlie Baker, that its members will oppose the SCORE Act, a bill to standardize athletes' contracting rights across the country, unless conference leaders oppose GOP-led redistricting efforts in states that include major conference members. The Congressional Black Caucus believes institutions that profit from black talent and black communities have a responsibility to stand with those communities when their fundamental rights are under attack, the CBC said in a Monday statement. Silence in the face of injustice is not neutrality, it is complicity. You've been listening to a reading of articles and features from the May 19th issue of the Toronto Star. Your reader has been Brian. Thank you for listening.